Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Good afternoon and welcome to our Gnoseologies event. My name is Giovanna Parmigiani and I'm the host of this series organized within the Transcendence and Transformation Initiative at the CSWR at Harvard Divinity School. This series focuses on ways of knowing that are often labeled as non-rational, traditionally referred to as gnosis in Western philosophical and religious traditions, and often understood in contraposition to science. These ways of knowing are becoming more and more influential in contemporary societies, popular culture, and academic research. What is the place of spirit possession, divination, and experiences perceived as out of the ordinary in our lives? How can we study and approach these types of phenomena? Going beyond dichotomies such as body and mind, ordinary and extraordinary, reason and experience, and matter and spirit. This series hosts scholars of different disciplines and practitioners interested in exploring and expanding the boundaries of what counts as knowledge today. Before introducing today's guest, one announcement: the Q&A feature here of Zoom is activated. Therefore, you can type there your questions for our guest, and I will try to ask them on your behalf if time permits. Please don't be shy. As the regulars to this series know, the best events are those in which we all participate in the conversation. And it goes without saying that if you have questions for us after the event, you can reach out to me by email, and I will share them with Dr. Pasulka. You can find my email address in the chat or in the CSWR and HDS websites. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce you and welcome today's guest, Diana Walsh Pasulka. Hi, Diana. Diana Walsh Pasulka is a distinguished professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and a leading scholar in religion, technology, and cultural studies. With a focus on the intersection of metaphysics, media, and the emerging technologies, her groundbreaking work explores how spiritual experiences and belief shape and are shaped by advancements in science and technology. Her widely acclaimed books, American Cosmic, UFOs, Religion, Technology, and Encounters, Experiences of the Extraordinary, have redefined scholarly and public discourse on the relationship between contemporary mysticism and technological innovation. Today, we will explore her upbringing in California during the dot-com boom, her research into Catholic history and purgatory, and the fieldwork that took her from sacred sites in New Mexico to the Vatican archives. From there, she will delve into her collaboration with aerospace innovators, her investigation into UAP phenomena, and how the study of religion intersects with emerging technologies and cultural paradigms. So welcome, Diana. I'm so glad you're here. I was telling you before the event that I had been wanting to have you in the Gnoseology series for a long time, and here you are. So I'm so happy.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So we usually start with backstories. We love backstories. So how did you get interested in religious studies, or which is the topics of your research? And yeah, what have been the main challenges and opportunities in your work as a scholar?
Yeah, I like this question, a rare question that I get asked. So I've been interested in religion for a long time. Since I was about 11 years old is when I first identified that this was what I was interested in. I was interested in people who had extraordinary experiences, and I wanted to understand them. And I was brought up in California, and my parents were, I would call them agnostic. My father was Catholic and my mother was Reformed Jewish. So I never actually attended churches, although sometimes my mother would take me to various churches. It was a very eclectic environment in terms of religion. And there was always the background of, a new age spirituality and things like that. I did go to a Catholic school, and some of the sisters who ran the school. These were the Sisters of Mercy, would also practice Buddhist meditation, So this is kind of how I grew up. I grew up in this I would call it a very specifically Northern California environment. And so I was interested in religion, but I didn't think I'd pursue it as a career because neither of my parents thought it was a good idea, right? So my father being an attorney and my mother being a nurse, medical practitioner, they were thinking that it would be best for me to do something different than that, and I understand that. So I did attend University of California, and I was a pre-med major, but I kept taking philosophy courses and religious studies courses because they were so interesting, and I just naturally gravitated to that. I graduated, and it was during basically when technology was, I'm from Northern California, so very close to Silicon Valley. My 8th grade class was one of the first beta testers of computers. And when I was an undergraduate, we had email, but we didn't have the internet yet, but we had email. And so I'd always, it wasn't as if I was always within this system of the infrastructure shifting to a technological infrastructure. And so, of course, that was going to impact me, whether I liked it or not. And then I finally decided at some point in the 90s that I was going to go back to university and study religion because that is what I was interested in. And my parents were still not on board with that, but I was a young adult, I could do what I wanted. And so I went to the GTU, which is the Graduate Theological Union, and I actually got a job at the Haas School of Business. It was my, side job, right? While I was taking religious studies courses and philosophy courses at UC Berkeley and so forth. And the Haas School of Business was a technology school. It was a business technology school. So it's UC Berkeley's MBA program. And at the time, Harvard and UC Berkeley developed the first online business courses for young people who were interested in technology, but couldn't be bothered getting an MBA because they were making too much money creating these startups. So they hired me as the data person to put in all the data. So I got to see what these young people were doing, close to my age, making $280,000 at that time period. That was a criteria for being accepted. So in a sense, I was always at the cutting edge as a onlooker, as a spectator of seeing this shift into a technological infrastructure. I got to meet the people who were doing it, and I kept ties with them through my experiences. And I did see how there was the interface of, screen culture and how people interpreted their own religious experiences. So before it was ever a thing in religious studies, this is what I was doing. But I didn't have a name for it, and so I continued on with what I was doing, and I did get my PhD at Syracuse University in the Catholic history and Catholic tradition. So that's really how I started doing this.
That's very interesting. And why were you interested in Catholicism? Because of your father, because of your upbringing, studying with nuns? I don't know. Why did you decide to study the purgatory imagery?
I know. Okay, so that happened because I was interested in the history of philosophy. So here I am, I'm taking a lot of courses on philosophy and religious studies, and I recognized that the Catholic tradition integrated both. And so if I could study, and to tell you the truth, also, I was interested in my own roots. So, my grandparents came from Ireland, and they were Catholic. And I was really interested in the religious traditions of Judaism and Catholicism. And so I thought that learning about that more in depth would give me the entrance really into studying the things that I wanted to study, which were cultural shifts because of tech, basically, Catholicism, which would allow me to study philosophy, and it did. So that's how I was interested. And in terms of purgatory for me was a great example of, first off, there is a dogma. Purgatory is a Catholic doctrine, but a lot of Catholics today have either not heard of it or they don't do the devotions that pre-Vatican II Catholics did. And so I was interested in the question of why did this devotion, which had been very core to that religion, why did it fly off the map? And so this ended up being quite a study, by the way. so I went
Yeah.
and did this, and it took me a long time, but I did in fact look at the reasons why this happened and presented it as a book in published by Oxford in 2012, and that was my first monograph. And it was an examination of purgatory and what people would call ascent narratives generally. So if you think of ascent narratives in almost every traditional religion, this is when, you even see it in the works of Plato, right? With Socrates, an idea of coming out of the cave, Dante's, Purgatorio and the Divine Comedy. This is his ascent narrative where the soul ascends. And so I focused on really ascent narratives. I was part and co-chair of the Death, Dying, and Beyond group at the American Academy of Religion for probably more than 10 years. And, we did a lot of ascent narrative discussions at the AAR. So this is what I was doing for a very long period of time, really until 2012.
That's very interesting. So can you summarize some of your theories and insights from this research on purgatory? And by the way, the cantica that I most like of Dante's is actually Purgatory. I think it's the best one. You just mentioned it, but it's my favorite. Yeah, what are your main findings and insights?
I think the most shocking one, and I opened it up the first chapter, is that in the early Middle Ages and up until when purgatory was actually codified by the Catholic Church in the 1200s as a doctrine, because that's when the word appears and they say, we have this practice, we're going to make it a doctrine, it's called purgatory. And there was, fighting with the Eastern Church about this, about the dogma of it. Okay, the first thing that I found out, which I thought was really interesting, was it was actually a place. So when you do look at the cartography, like the maps of this time period, you'll see the Garden of Eden, and you'll see places on there like Purgatory. So it was thought of as an actual place, and it is a place. Okay, when I say that, I'm saying that there's a physical place. So there was a place in Italy called the Purgatory Cave, but there was a very famous one in Ireland on a lake, an island called Loch Derg, a red lake in Ireland, and there was a Purgatory Cave. And people who had some pretty grave sins would then be okayed by their bishop to go to this Purgatory Cave in Ireland and go into the cave for 24 hours. And then after that, they were given your sins are now forgiven. So it was actually a place of purgation. And this is how a lot of people thought of purgatory at this time period. Now, the place was really interesting because in fact, I think it's pretty interesting. Dante actually had this book in his library, and it is called the Cave of is called St. Patrick's Purgatory. And it's written by a monk about a knight it's a medieval bestseller, by the way, who goes into this cave and fights demons and sees angels. Basically, the cave was an entrance to the supernatural. So it wasn't a sense of today we think of matter and spirit, and you mentioned the dualism of matter and spirit. Well, that wasn't the case back then. This wasn't the framework. So for medieval practitioners here, they're seeing this place as a place they can access physically. So they can go through, but there is a gate though, and the gate is this Purgatory Cave. So once they pass this gate, they're now in a dangerous place where, they have to contend with supernatural beings like angels and demons and things like that. And so this knight goes through there, fights with some of the demons, survives the night and lives to tell about it. And then this is written down by a monk, And then it's a huge bestseller. And Dante had this, and he does indeed make his Purgatory an island, right? So it's like this island. And so I learned a lot about medieval practices regarding purgatory. And that's, I think, the most interesting part, because when we think of purgatory today, even if the Pope says something about it, which is very rare, but if the Pope comes out and says something about purgatory, generally, I know former Pope Benedict said that it's, don't think of it as a physical place, think of it as a state of being. But they certainly thought of it as a physical place back in that time period.
That's very interesting. And I now can see maybe how you transition to UFOs. But it would be great if you spelled out how this happened and how actually you encountered your interlocutors and so on, because I'd really want to concentrate on American Cosmic, which is, by the way, the book that I first read about you. So I encountered you through this book, and also some of my students, and we all loved it. So how did you transition from Purgatory to UFOs? Through ascension or through something else?
Okay, so I had spent a lot of time in archives and looking at ascent narratives, and from the Catholic historical record. So about 10 years. So it was a long time. And what I found was that Catholics from various centuries really had experiences that they couldn't understand, and they didn't really have a category yet to put them in. So a lot of times when a Catholic person, say in France in 1800 or something, sees something in the sky, a lot of times they'll interpret it as a soul from purgatory that needs to be prayed back into purgatory. And I have one of these examples in my book about this, the Purgatory book. But I don't ever talk about UFOs because I hadn't actually gotten to that point yet when I was writing this book. But what happened was I encountered a lot of these people talking about, records of aerial phenomena that, again, were confusing to Catholics. So they would then say, okay, well, this is what the person sees, but this is then how it gets, well, we believe it's this, a soul from purgatory, or a flying house, or, something like that. And then I saw those and I thought they were odd. So I kept a log of them, and I knew I would come back to them later, but I didn't know how I was going to come back to them. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. It's something that exceeds their interpretive framework, their cultural interpretive framework. And it's fascinating. And I'm going to keep this log. So I kept going. And then I say about when the book was published, I was going to be writing about John England, who's a bishop in the Carolinas, and I had a lot of access to his records. He was really an interesting guy, a colonial time period in the United States. I was on to that, but I talked to a friend of mine, and I gave my log of reports to my friend, and I said, what do you think of this? And he looked at it, and he said something that I'll never forget it because it was so shocking. He said, this looks like a Steven Spielberg film. And I was like, what? And he said, like UFOs, this looks like UFOs. And I was like, UFOs, get out of here. That's crazy. So coincidentally, that very week, there was a conference that had to do with UFOs in near my town in Wilmington, North Carolina. And so I went to that being, interested. And what I heard was, I heard those reports, but they were upgraded, right? They were changed. They were the same. The pattern match was similar. I see this in the sky. It's not a drone. It's not an airplane. I don't know what it is. I'm confused. And then they go to the framework of UFOs, right? Even if they're Christian, even if they're, atheist and that type of thing, they still go to that. So I thought, okay, this makes a lot of sense. And that's when I began my study. And I could share
Yes.
Okay, I'll share some images of what, prompted me to make this move. So let me go to right here.
There we go.
Okay, so so during the purgatory research, I would be looking at the image on the left and the image of the monk seeing an orb up above that looks either like a star or a cross or something. It's an illuminated light. And these are the images that I would then be exposed to through the research on purgatory. And you can see that this is a painting by an artist over here on the left who's doing, these are souls ascending into heaven, okay? And there are a lot of ascending souls into heaven in the Catholic record. And if you go into churches in Europe, you will most likely see an ascension, souls ascending, okay? Well, I started to look at the images that the representations of modern UFO abductions, and I saw the similarity. And I said, okay, well, this isn't a difficult move, right? So, but how did we do this academically was then my question, So you can make this case that we just have new interpretive frameworks and things like that. I'll show you another one. Again, here are, you can't really tell the difference here, which is the soul ascending to heaven and which is the person being, ascending into a UFO. So, so it's very similar. So the representation is very similar. So this is how I started to get into the research. What I did not expect though was that I would be meeting people, and here I'll just give one more image before I leave it at that. So within a year of 2012 and doing this kind of work where, I'd go to the AAR and I'd present some of my research and I'd say, this is what I'm doing now. And people would be all right with it because, in the American Academy of Religion, we understand this framework for understanding belief systems, belief and practice systems. But these are the people that then got in touch with me, and they're from these companies, many of them. And this is Chris Hadfield. He's an astronaut. And on his left is my colleague now, who is Dr. Ia Whiteley, and she's at University College London, and she trains astronauts and pilots. So each of these people, so these types of people, especially people like Ia, would reach out to me, and they were asking me to share my data with them, my angel contact events data, right? Or my ascent narrative data. And honestly, it was shocking to me because I thought, here I am looking at this from a very historical, critical method, completely off the table, the question, ontological questions of, is this real or not? No, I'm not asking those questions, but they're coming from the ontological perspective that this is real. And we need to know, how it's been here for a long time is what their assumption is. And so this was shocking to me. And so I fielded a number of these, requests for information. And finally I said, okay, I'm going to go into this topic now, and I'm going to really look at it because there's a lot more going on than I thought.
That's very fascinating. You were somehow called into this, right? Slowly, from your tech upbringing to, people reaching out to you after a presentation at AAR. What I found very interesting, there are a number of things I find very interesting in your book, but you just said that you mostly spent 10 years of your life in archives studying, Middle Ages. And then in the book, you find yourself actually talking to people, doing things with people, right? How was the transition into this, ethnographic-like sort of a space for one who was used to working archives, basically, right? How was it?
Yeah. Well, it was a natural progression because what happened was that at the end of the Purgatory book, I end with what's happened to Purgatory. So I do ethnography. So, I did learn about ethnography. I knew how to do it. I went back and talked to friends who were anthropologists. And then I did ethnography for the Purgatory book. So I talked to Vatican II Catholics who were born prior to Vatican II and knew what, the old style Catholicism was like. And so I interviewed them about Purgatory and what they thought about that and their own experiences. And so I was, in a sense, ready then when the aerospace people started to contact me. I recognized that this was a really great source of data for me. And I thought, okay, these are believers, right? They have a belief and a practice, right? So I'm going to go into these communities now, like I did to the Purgatory communities, and I'm going to learn from them. And so they thought they were coming to get my data, and I was like, I'm going to be with you now and talk about this, and I'm going to go to your conferences, and I think it's really neat what you're doing, and they were very welcoming. So that's how it began, and it's only gotten more. You could call it. There's more of them now. After the 2017 New York Times articles by Leslie Kane and Ralph Blumenthal, that took off, and more aerospace people felt courage to come and talk and share their experiences. So I was already pivoting to ethnography at the end of the Purgatory book, and then I just went full into it.
Fantastic. So tell us a little bit about who are your interlocutors, who are the main protagonists of the book, the findings, and also if you want to mention, I find very fascinating somehow you change your positionality through your ethnography. There are so many ethnography that are written with the assumption that the ethnographer remains the same throughout the process, but you're very candid in a very vulnerable and powerful way in showing the phases, right? Somehow how you change through your research. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the book?
Yes. Okay. So I was working with the same editor who's wonderful, Cynthia Reed, and that I worked with, during the Purgatory book, and she and there's no doubt that she was shocked, right, by what was happening. But she's the one who actually suggested that I write American Cosmic. She goes, "Your research is really interesting. Let's do it. Let's write it." And I said, "Okay." And so as I started to do it, it occurred to me that I don't believe that this has been done yet, kind of thing. That occurred to me. And I thought, how will I possibly do this? I was working closely with Jeffrey Kripal, who is at Rice and does the same type of work. And so we would workshop it. We would say he met the people that I know, my friends and so forth. We'd have these conferences and I'd say, well, let's invite this scientist and let's invite that one. And he trusted me and he said, yeah, let's do it. And so we began these conversations. And so I said, the first thing I did was I wrote an essay for one of Jeff's books for Macmillan, which is basically how to do this type of research. And that was a hard one because that really kind of, this is where I, in a sense, formulated how I was going to do this with doing it responsibly without doing it in, a scholarly ancient aliens type of thing, where you're just looking at the past as a continuation of what's going on, and we just have better technology now and that type of thing. And that is definitely not how I wanted to do this. So I wanted to maintain this ability to say, first, we don't actually know what it is, right? But we know that there's something that confuses people. So I focused on those things that I could identify as perennial, really. And there are some things. One is this confusion, and if you listen to the fighter pilots, even today, I was speaking with a fighter pilot, a woman, just recently. She's one of the ones that came out. Her name is Alex. I think it's Alex Dietrich, but Alex for sure. And she described seeing a UFO with friends of hers who were also flying their jets. And she said the first thing that came to her mind was that she said, not another jet, not one of ours. WTF is how she put it, right? WTF. And so that, in a sense, was a common element. It happened to Teresa of Avila when she identifies this little being that she then identifies as an angel, but at first she doesn't. And thank goodness we have her own testimony of this in her autobiography of her angel contact event. And she says, I don't know what this is, but I can tell you that it's real. It's not imaginary, and it's on, it's like luminescent. And, she has, and it even has something that looks like a dart with, she describes it as a dart with fire on the end of it. So some kind of an instrument. And So this is what I started to do. So I started to hammer out how I was going to do this, and I had to be honest. So that's that vulnerability that you talk about, because I thought these are people that are in my field, and I owe them an explanation about how this is happening to me and how it's shocking, and this is how I'm going to deal with it through, working it out with the people that I'm working with. And that's how it came out. So I'm glad that a lot of people resonated with that.
No, absolutely. And who are the protagonists of the book? Who you are working with in the book?
Yes, yes.
And where do you go? What do you do? I
Yeah.
think that's so fascinating.
Yeah, so I opened the book with some of the people that I met. Some of them had to be anonymous. Some of them have now come out as themselves because of the climate. The climate has changed. So this is in 2014 to 15, 16, 17, and no one was really talking about UFOs publicly, right, before 2017. All right. So the aerospace person, I named them Tyler D, and that person remains anonymous and has to be. Um, the other person that I work closely with is Dr. Gary Nolan, and he's from Stanford, and he is a really amazing biologist there, pathologist, a medical doctor, researcher, and he's come out as himself, but he was James. Okay, so the aerospace person, he was on the Space Force, and he worked with he was studying what we now call UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena, and he's noticed that I was skeptical, and I did not believe. And so he said, "You've been working with me now for 2 years, and I've shown you a lot of interesting things, and you're writing this book." He goes, "But you don't believe." And he said, "I think I could tip you over so that you could actually become a believer. I can take you to a place where there was a crashed craft. It's in New Mexico. It's not Roswell, and I have access to it. And I can take you there and show you what I do, what kinds of things I do." And I thought, this is a great experience, but I'm not going alone. I need someone to go with me. So I thought Gary would be a great person because he was already studying materials from alleged crashes. Okay. And again, I was not going to say that these were real, okay, because I don't know. But I was going in as a person who's doing this study, and I made that very clear to everyone, and they were okay with that. So so he said, "Sure, Gary can come, but we have to be blindfolded to go to this place. It's in New Mexico, and the crash happened in the 40s, okay? And apparently the government from the 50s put a lot of cans on the site that then became rubble so that people with metal detectors couldn't go in. But we went out there and we did find interesting things there. And Gary took it back and studied it. And I would say that it was a very interesting experience. Obviously, it comprises the first two chapters of my book, and I don't ever say that this is what it is. This is exactly what Tyler D said it was, but he had a credible, legitimate job, and that was not in dispute. So I thought it was very interesting I even contemplated that this was misinformation that was being planted on me. So there was every kind of thing that went through my mind during this event. So we went to New Mexico, and we found debris. Gary brought it back. Gary's now got this foundation called the Soul Foundation, affiliated with Stanford, and he actually does study things like this today. And so that's the first event that happened in that I record in the book. And I can, I guess, pause here for any kind of questions that you might have before we get to going to the Vatican, because that does happen too.
Of course, let's look at the audience questions. So there might be some audience question that are interested in this particular. So Sharon, which is the last one, if our man-made AI eventually mediates human consciousness through upcoming technologies such as directly connecting the brain to computers, for example, Neuralink, could that virtual space be a digital purgatory where your consciousness soul could persist without death? And maybe this is the same place non-human intelligence is able to interact with us. Maybe this is how we are visited when NHI can come to us. They're opening up this virtual space to us and linking with us telepathically. So this is a broad question, probably picking your asking your opinion on AI and how AI discourses are, also part of the conversation.
Absolutely. It's an on topic, amazing question. And I have the same question. And I also have some of the intuitions that are there as assumptions in that question, or just questions in the question. Like, what space is this, right? Um, is it a physical space? Is it somehow a non-local, what type of space is it? So during the time period that I wrote the books that I wrote, the monographs, I also published a lot of papers. And the papers are focused specifically on this development of researchers across the world, but particularly in the United States, of basically brain to computer, brain machine interfaces, right? BCIs. So this I'm fascinated with. So you can see in my research and what I've done that I have this, the books that I'm doing are focusing on kind of the broader conversation, but very specifically, it's coming out of this other conversation that's happening. In fact, right now, I'm in conversation with people who believe that there is a non-local reality that we interface with when we are doing divination or these kinds of practices, and that it's people are trying to replicate it now. Like, Elon Musk just has, I think, successfully or put in an application to I forgot the name of it, maybe copyright, but that might not be the name, but copyright telekinesis and telepathy, as names for his business, what he's doing now, which I think is we've made huge strides now in looking at signals and synapses and things like that, and transferring that information into data that computers are now able to read and do things with, really. So this is fascinating to me. And also, when I look at the historical record, particularly the Catholic historical record, I also see that there were visionaries who saw this time period, like Teilhard de Chardin, the paleontologist, uh, really accurately describes kind of what's happening now, and that the human being is going to shift because of what appears to be AI. AI is a non-human intelligence, okay? And I think that right now, this is the question that, why is it now that we're talking about UAP when AI is a reality in all of our lives? That's a great question. I don't have
That's
an answer.
fantastic.
I just thought I'd throw that out there.
No, that's fantastic. And I thought it should be mentioned because it is, I felt, part of the conversation. Mark asks a couple of questions that I also wanted to ask you, actually. So Mark and I are on the same page here. So is in writing your ethnography and developing on your fieldwork, were you inspired by any other ethnographers or anthropologists? Because the book manages to be academic, but very accessible to lay audience. How did you land on that voice?
Yes. So this was a struggle. And I would say that people who inspired me to think this way would be Jeffrey Kripal, because his books are similar in the sense that, much better, of course, but his books are ethnographies in a sense that he does, it's a very intellectual, but he does talk to people, right? So he talks to the scientists, he talk like Jacques Vallée and people like that. So he does actually spend time talking with people and getting a read really on what they're doing. So I would say that that voice emerged basically from my struggle of trying to convey as clearly as possible how I was going through a period of rethinking how I did religious studies. So you know, I do have another, there are some books that I really like that are ethnographies, but I can't for the life of me remember the name, but I will when we're done. I'll figure out who's, you know, and share that with you so that
I
I
think
can.
there's also a political dimension in the accessibility of the research we're doing, and Jeff Kripal is doing an amazing job. I'm not sure we'd call his work ethnographies, and as anthropologists have to say, we might slightly disagree here, but definitely is rich and academically founded and accessible. And I think I think it really models ways to engage with scholarship that I agree with you are somehow the future and necessary if we address certain topics more than others. And something like UFOs, I think, asks for this type of language. And this is also linked to Julian's question, who asks if you had experiences with entities since you have been diving deeper into this subject.
Good question. So the entity question, like the you know, which is the question that I don't think any academic welcomes, right? Because it's like puts you on the spot. Are there the, you know, people report these entities, and specifically with respect to UFOs, like little gray beings or little beings, you know, about 3 to 4 feet tall. And no, I have not. First off, I have discovered though that my own family, as soon as my book came out, and you know, they never generally read what I've written, but they read that one, and then they said, "Did you know Uncle Joe, you know, had this happen? And you know, did you know your father had this happen when he was in the Coast Guard?" And you know, and I started to see that my family has a rich history of this type of event happening to them. And you know, I have a lot of people who don't want that out, right? But you know, they came to tell me, and I was like, you know, can I talk about this? And they were like, maybe, you know. So yeah, so but not me. Okay, so I would say that I don't I have had some experiences, but not with those kinds of things like entities. But I've talked to lots of people who wish they'd never seen little people associated with UFOs, but they have. And it seems like, you know, even people in the Catholic historical record saw things like this. And so you know, it would be really easy and, you know, convenient to say, I have nothing to say about that. But there is too much, you know, observational data of people who, even, you know, police officers and so forth, who wouldn't make that up and things like that. You know, a lot of people don't want. So as many people say they've seen UFOs, there's so many more who've seen them and will never say that they've seen them.
Thank you. Then Jeffrey says, Jeff Kripal has the most intelligent takes on paranormal of anyone I've encountered inside and outside of academia. I think extremely highly of him personally and professionally. We all agree. I think we can all agree with you, Jeffrey. So before we move on to other questions, because the chat is on fire, actually, Diana, yeah, do you want to transition to, you mentioned you want to go back to the Vatican and see what happens there. And so do you want to continue with the story that you were telling?
Yes. Okay, so I was already scheduled before even I did the UFO research to go to the Vatican and look at the canonization records of Joseph of Cupertino, who is known as the levitating saint. Philip Eyre just wrote a book called, They Flew. All right, so Yale University Press, and about Joseph. And also Sister Maria of Agreda, a Spanish nun of the same time period, who also had similar types of experiences. And I was to go there to gather this data, okay? And part of the reason I was going was because there was a man who was a Catholic man whose aunt had levitated. She was a nun, and she was known to levitate, and also things would light on fire around her. And so he was really fascinated. So he asked me to go as well. So and partially funded the trip. Very, well-off person. So I was already scheduled to go. Tyler D suggested that he go too. He said, I could actually look at some of this data and help you analyze it because of what I do. He looks at things that about people levitating and, all those things that we just saw in the images. That's what he looks at also. And I thought, okay, well, that kind of makes sense. So I suggested that and to my team, who were behind this. And so he went too. And so we went to the Vatican. I honestly did not think that he could get in because you really have to have specific credentials to get into what's now called the Apostolic Library, which is previously the Secreto, which is the secret library, the Pope's library, right? Of these things and these documents, manuscripts. And so I had to have a specific credential to get in. I was let in, but he couldn't get in because he's not Catholic. He's not associated with the Catholic Church, and he works in a field that's completely has nothing to do with Catholic history. So he was having a hard time getting in while I was on the plane to fly to the Vatican. So he was texting me and saying, I'm having a hard time flying in. Getting into the Vatican archive. I'm going to show them my ID. And I thought, that seems like a bad idea because I know what his ID means. It means that he's affiliated with, some things here in the United States. The Vatican might not want him there. And so I said, no, wait till I get there. And so after about an hour more, he said, let me just do it. And I said, okay, go ahead. And so he did share his ID, and lo and behold, he got access. He got access immediately. And then he met important people there that I would never have met. So there was something there that was really interesting to me. How does this man have so much access? And here I am, I have all the credentials, but I don't have as much access as he. So we were able to talk to papal advisors and, people who were basically Vatican insiders about lots of different things. And then I believe he still works with the Vatican. So he immediately became, part of, he immediately became the story again. So I had to write that in because it was exactly what happened.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Diana. We have 10 minutes left, and I cannot believe how time flies here. But do you want to tell us a bit about your current research?
Yes. So my current research goes back to the original person's question about AI. Because when I started this research, I had this question. I met Jacques Vallée, who is a very fascinating man. He got his PhD from Northwestern in 1968 or 69 in information science. And he's incredible. So he's this technologist. He lives in San Francisco. He's French. And he's one of the foremost researchers, if not the foremost researcher on UFOs and UAP historically. He wrote a definitive book called Passport to Magonia in 1968 on the topic, still one of the best books out there about it. All right, so I met him in about 2013, maybe 2012, and I thought to myself, there's a huge connection here between UFOs and technology, but I don't quite know what it is yet, okay? And so I kept pursuing that. And as the years went on, I learned more and more. And it is my belief that it has everything to do with AI and the time period we're in. So as I continued with my book, a lot of people in the AI creative community who are AI creators and had been for 20 years or so. So by this time, they're very wealthy because, you know, people in that community have been using and utilizing AI for banking purposes. Okay, so banks have been using it for 20 years. And so they all reached out to me and said, this Tyler guy, this is like me. This is exactly how I get information and create AI. And I thought, wow. So I met them. And so through meeting these people now, I'm writing a new book, which is about AI and UAP. And so that book is due soon, actually. So I'm really working on that right now, and conducted a lot of interviews with fascinating people. And so this is the work I'm doing now. And I believe that it's basically an answer to the question that I had when I met Jacques Vallée, which was, what is this very inextricable and intimate connection between technology and UFOs? I don't quite understand it. And this, I feel like there's some headway, we're making some headway on this. It has to do with AI.
Wonderful. You can access the questions actually that we are asked. So pick one. Pick one question that you,
Oh, from the chat?
From the chat box, yes.
Okay.
I think there's so many questions. We need to give space to our.
I have to say that I have the webinar chat, but it doesn't look like I see their. Oh, I see the whole other. Oh, Mark.
The Q&A.
Okay. All right. I got that question. Okay. There's Sharon's question, which I got. Okay. Here's a good question, Nick. How has your thinking changed towards the UAP topic and towards your own faith during your journey from 2012 to 2025? So yes, I mean, this is in religious studies, we don't generally bring our own, you know, experience of that in, but it did, of course, change me. And I think that, I mean, honestly, I think all of us scholars have it, what we do impacts us. I'm beginning to understand certain types of religious studies as of ways of practicing. So again, I talk about Teilhard de Chardin, who's the paleontologist, very well-known Catholic visionary and scientist. And he talked about how his research was his faith practice, was a form of devotion. Okay. And I think that a lot of people even in anthropology who I've met, who are at, you know, like places like Stanford, University of Chicago, this is the way in which they understand their faith practice is religious studies. And I know that's something that, you know, people don't actually say in religious studies, but I think we should consider that. I think we should think, you know, that this is one way to approach things that are of the ultimate questions, I think. That's how I'd answer that one.
Wonderful. So is there an advice, if you had to give an advice to graduate students who want to study UFOs or UAPs, do you have any advice to share? Or something that you would have liked to know when you started this journey of yours?
Yeah. So when I started, first off, be careful because don't go all in on a UAP dissertation just yet. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think the best way to do this is to approach it from what your question originally was. So say you're doing study in in Catholic history or Jewish history or Islam, right? And you've got your time period and you've got, the thing you're looking at, most likely in there is going to be information that will help you understand what we call unidentified anomalous phenomena. Okay. And so and then read the work of the people who are working in this field now. But also understand that we're still within these institutions. I mean, even look at the field that I chose for myself, which was technology and religion. Okay. So this isn't even a department yet, or this isn't even, you know, something that you see at the Harvard Divinity School or, at any of the programs. You don't see that yet. So be careful because, you've got to still, if you want to do this work as doing it in the field, you actually, we're still within bureaucracy and institutions. So do the cutting edge research, but do it within, like I did it within Catholic history. Okay. So that's the best way to do it. And plus, I was already a tenured professor and a full professor and the chair of my department. So I felt like I was okay to take on these questions and to work them out. So I had freedom in that sense. For younger people, who I do work with in different fields, so many different fields. Another thing to do is talk to each other. So don't just talk to people in the humanities. Go out and talk to the scientists who are doing this work. If you're an artist, talk to the scientists. If you're in humanities, talk to the scientists. If you're in science, talk to people in the humanities.
That's fantastic. Do you see the academia changing in the near future around this topic together with society? You mentioned 2017 as the year in which everything somehow changes. And right now, there are lots of public conversations, way more than 10 years ago, on this topic. Do you see academia changing and, in the near future, or do you think it's going to take a little longer? What do you think? What are your...
Yes, I think that it is changing. So right now, there are people within the government are wanting to create, spaces like this, spaces where these conversations are happening within academic institutions. And so if people in the government are hoping for this, there will be money coming along to make that happen. So I've been in the rooms where this conversation is already started, and the question is what institutions are going to be doing this, and how are we going to structure it. So I've been involved also in looking at how that could possibly be structured. So it is happening. It's happening. I don't know how fast, but then when I published American Cosmic, I honestly didn't think that the government disclosure of UAPs was going to happen for another 10 years or so. And it happened as my book was in press.
So that's great. I think it's time to wrap up now. So thank you, Diana, for your participation, generosity in sharing, all this with us and wonderful conversation. And thank you all for having been with us and for the wonderful questions. Please stay tuned on the activities of the CSWR, the Transcendence and Transformation Initiative, and of Nosologies, of course. You can find this information on the CSWR website that you can find in the chat. And again, if you have further questions for us, please feel free to reach out to me and we'll share a question with Professor Pasulka. So thank you all for being with us and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu, copyright 2025, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.